The great hall of ice was silent. Blue torches burned coldly against the crystal walls, throwing long shadows over armored soldiers and pale generals who stood in perfect lines. The sound of chains echoed as a human was dragged forward, pushed, down on the frozen floor. His breath turned to mist in the freezing air, and his heart pounded so loud that he swore everyone could hear it. That human was John. Just John. Not a soldier of fame, not a diplomat, not a hero. He was a mechanic who fixed ships, a man who had been captured when his vessel was raided in orbit. He had no business standing before the most feared ruler in the galaxy. Yet here he was, trembling before her throne. The throne itself was made of pure frost, carved from the heart of a dead glacier. Upon it sat the dread Queen Frigid. Her armor shimmered like frozen steel, and her long hair flowed like strands of silver ice. Her eyes glowed faintly, pale blue, so sharp that every soul in the hall lowered their gaze. To look directly into her eyes was like staring into a storm of endless winter. Stories of her cruelty were whispered across 100 systems. She had frozen entire fleets in the dark void of space. She had shattered armies with a single gesture. Worlds surrendered when her banners appeared in the skies. No one dared mock her. No one dared speak out of turn. No one, except John. The soldiers had dragged him here expecting his execution. A low human, daring to speak when ordered to stay silent. He had raised his voice when her officers laughed about humanity's weakness. He had said too loudly that humans didn't bow so easily, and now he was here kneeling before death itself. The Queen leaned forward, her voice colder than the air. "You, human, do you understand what happens to those who insult my court?" John's throat was dry. His mind screamed at him to stay quiet. His body wanted to collapse. But fear did strange things to men, and John had always been the kind who spoke when he should not. He looked up at her, not at the ground like the others, and words stumbled out before he could stop them. "If you're really that scary," he blurted, his lips shaking, "why don't you just marry me?" Then humanity would surrender without a fight. The moment froze. The generals gasped. The soldiers shifted, their weapons rising in disbelief. Some even laughed cruelly, certain that the human had just begged for a quick death with a fool's joke. A joke in the face of the Queen of Frost. Madness. But Frigid did not laugh. She did not frown. She only tilted her head, studying him as though he were some strange creature. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time her soldiers trembled not at her rage but at her silence. The cold stretched for long seconds. Then her lips parted. Very well. The hall erupted in shock. Weapons clattered to the floor. Her generals shouted protests, but their voices faltered under her gaze. The dread Queen of Ice had spoken, and her word was law. John blinked, his heart hammering. He thought he had misheard. What? He whispered. Frigid stood, her tall figure shining with frost. Her voice carried like a crack across a frozen lake. "You dared to speak boldly. You dared to look at me without fear. You have made an offer, human, and I accept." The sound of her final word slammed into John's chest harder than any blow. Accept? She had accepted? He wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream that it was only a joke. But the hall around him was already moving, guards bowing, attendants preparing, as if the Queen had announced a sacred decree. John was not executed. He was not dragged away in chains. Instead, he was lifted to his feet and treated like a chosen one. The Queen's chosen consort. His mind swirled. Just hours ago, he was a prisoner. Now, he was bound by words he had never meant, a mechanic of earth tied to the dread Queen of Cold. As he was led from the throne room, his heart whispered the truth he could not say aloud. He had joked about marriage, and the most terrifying being in the galaxy had just said yes. The days after the throne room felt unreal to John. He had expected chains. He had expected a cold cell, torture, or even death. Instead, he found himself placed in chambers of crystal and silver. The walls glowed faintly with blue light. and the floor was covered with furs from beasts of alien worlds. Servants brought him food that steamed in the frozen air, fruit that glowed like embers, and wines chilled to frost. John did not feel like a prisoner. He felt like a guest. No, more than that. The word no one dared say out loud was groom. Every soldier who passed him saluted stiffly, though their eyes burned with dislike. The generals whispered that the queen had lost her mind, but none of them dared to say it in her presence. Her word was absolute, and she had chosen him. John sat many nights staring at his reflection in the polished ice. His brown hair was messy, his hands were scarred from years of repairing ships, and his face was far from noble. He looked like what he was, a tired mechanic from Earth, a nobody. How could someone like him be called the consort of the most feared queen in the galaxy? When he asked her, she answered in her usual voice, calm, steady, and colder than stone. You spoke without trembling. None of my warriors do that. They kneel, they beg, they flatter. But you mocked me. You looked into my eyes. I have chosen you. John wanted to argue. He wanted to shout that it had been a joke, that he hadn't meant it. But every time the words came to his lips, something inside him stopped. Because when she looked at him, there was something behind her, cold eyes, something faint, hidden but real. Loneliness. The dread Queen Frigid was feared by all. She was obeyed by millions. Yet John realized that she was alone in her throne room, surrounded by people who bowed but never spoke to her as if she were human. Perhaps that was why his foolish words had struck her. He had spoken to her like a person, not a monster. Day by day, their strange life began to take shape. At the long table of ice, he sat across from her while servants placed plates between them. She ate in silence, her hands graceful, her eyes sometimes flicking toward him when she thought he wasn't looking. At first, John kept his head low, unsure of what to say, but one night, unable to stand the silence, he cracked a small smile and said, You know, back on Earth, dinners are noisy. Families talk, argue, even laugh. It feels strange to eat without a sound. She looked at him for a long moment, then asked softly, Do you miss it? The question caught him off guard. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I miss it every day. That was all she said. But after that night, she began to ask him small questions. About Earth, about the sea, about the sound of birds in the morning. He answered with simple words, painting pictures of warmth and life that she had never seen. They also walked together. The palace had gardens made of ice flowers, glowing softly in the dark, their petals carved by frost. She would lead him through the frozen paths, her tall figure shining under the light of alien moons. She never touched him, never spoke much, but her presence beside him was constant. John began to notice how the soldiers watched them with confusion. Some were angry, some disgusted, but others, just a few, looked at him with something else. Curiosity. Hope. And in the quiet of his chambers, John asked himself again and again, What am I doing here? He was still afraid of her, of course. She was powerful, dangerous, untouchable. But the more time he spent near her, the more he began to see past the armor of ice. She was a ruler, yes, a conqueror, yes, but she was also a woman who had not been spoken to as a woman in a very long time. That thought haunted him more than the cold ever could, and though John had entered her palace as a prisoner, he now stood each morning wondering if he was something more. Something chosen, something seen, something he could not yet name. At first, John believed the queen's heart was frozen like the walls around her. She gave commands with sharp words, punished betrayal without pause, and stood tall with no sign of weakness. To her people, she was not a woman at all. She was a force of nature, the winter that never ended. But as the days passed, John began to notice small things, tiny cracks in the ice. It happened one evening when he was fixing a small device in his chamber. His hands were clumsy from the cold, and the blade slipped, cutting his palm. The sting made him hiss, and drops of red fell. on the white furs. Before he could wrap the wound, the air grew colder, and she appeared at the doorway. The queen rarely entered without guards announcing her, but this time she came alone, moving swiftly. Her pale eyes locked on his hand, and for the first time, he saw them tremble. She raised her fingers and a soft frost formed over his skin, sealing the wound with ice. It stung, but the bleeding stopped instantly. "You should be careful," she said, her voice quieter than usual. John stared at her. He had expected anger at his clumsiness, but what he saw instead was worry. Her face was calm, but her fingers shook slightly as they left his hand. In that moment, the dread Queen Frigid did not look like a conqueror. She looked like someone afraid of losing something small but precious. Another crack in the ice came when he spoke about Earth. They had been walking through her frozen gardens, the flowers glowing faint blue in the dark. The silence pressed on John, heavy and cold, so he spoke to break it. He described the ocean back home, how the waves roared and the sand burned hot under the sun. He told her about children laughing while chasing each other along the shore, and about seagulls crying overhead. To his surprise, she slowed her steps. Her eyes softened as if she were seeing his words instead of the garden before her. "Tell me more," she whispered. So he did. Night after night, she asked again and again about the sea, the forests, the warm rain that fell on rooftops. She listened to every detail as though she were drinking in something she had been thirsty for all her life. John began to realize she had never known such things. She had grown up in palaces of frost, on worlds where the sun barely warmed the sky. Her life had been battle and rule, commands and silence. She knew power, but she had never known the simple warmth of a summer day, and the final crack came when he laughed. It was a clumsy laugh, nothing grand. He had been telling a story of his work back on Earth, how a ship engine had once exploded after he hit it with the wrong tool, sending him flying into a pile of grease. He chuckled at the memory, and the sound filled the chamber. For a moment, the queen simply stared. Then her shoulders lowered ever so slightly and her lips parted. She did not laugh, but her face softened, and she looked at him as if hearing laughter for the first time in centuries. John saw it then. Behind the armor, behind the cold, there was someone deeply lonely, someone who had built a world of ice around herself to survive, and against all reason, all fear, all logic. John felt something stir inside him. He was supposed to hate her. She was the enemy of his people, the conqueror of countless worlds. But when he saw the way her fingers had trembled at his wound, the way her eyes longed for the sound of waves, the way she listened to his laughter like it was music, he could not see her as just a monster anymore. He began to see her as Frigid, not the dread queen, not the terror of the stars, but a woman hidden beneath endless layers of frost. And the thought terrified him more than anything else, because John knew that once you began to care for someone, they had the power to break you. And somehow, against all odds, he had begun to care. The palace was colder than ever, but John felt a storm brewing that had nothing to do with ice. The queens.
Generals hated him. He saw it in their eyes every time he entered the throne room at her side.
They bowed to her, yes, but their stares at him were sharp as knives. They muttered in corners, their voices low but filled with scorn. A human, a weak creature, chosen as consort. It was an insult to their honor. To them, he was unworthy. A shameful joke turned law. Some soldiers spat on the ground after he passed. Others bumped his shoulder, pretending it was an accident. He ignored them, but he felt their hatred wrapping around him like chains. One night, as he walked through a dim corridor, he felt danger. A shadow slipped from behind a column, and a blade gleamed in the pale torchlight. Before he could cry out, the air froze solid and the assassin dropped, encased in ice. Frigid stood at the far end of the hall, her hand raised, frost still spilling from her fingers. She did not even glance at the fallen soldier. She only looked at John, her eyes cold, but unreadable. "You are mine," she said simply. "None may harm you." Her words should have comforted him, but instead they twisted inside his chest. He was protected, yes, but by fear, not love. Was he just a symbol? A possession? A joke she had taken seriously? The doubt grew heavier each day. One evening, as snow drifted outside the crystal windows, she came to him dressed in her armor. Her face was unreadable, her voice steady. "Do you regret speaking that day?" she asked. "Do you wish me to undo it?" The question struck him like a blade. He stared at her, searching her eyes. For once, there was no mask of ice. There was something fragile there, something that made his chest ache. She was giving him a chance. She was giving him an escape. John thought of that first moment in the throne room, when fear had made him blurt out a foolish joke. He remembered the gasps, the silence, the way she had tilted her head and accepted. He remembered how angry and scared he had been at first. But he also remembered the way her hand had trembled when she healed his wound, the way her voice had softened when she asked about the ocean, the way she listened to his laughter like it was the first drop of spring in endless winter. Slowly he shook his head. "I don't regret it," he said softly. His voice cracked, but his eyes did not leave hers. Not anymore. The Queen of Frost stood very still. Then, to his shock, her lips curved into the faintest smile. Not the cruel smile of a conqueror, not the victorious smile of a ruler, but the quiet, almost shy smile of a woman hearing words she never thought she'd hear. That smile stayed with him long after she left the room. But the storm outside did not end. The court still whispered, the generals still seethed. His people, the humans, still fought against her fleets. He was trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. To the humans, he was a traitor. To her people, he was an insult. And yet, when he thought of walking away, his heart tightened painfully. He didn't want to. Not anymore. The doubt remained, heavy and sharp, but something else had begun to grow alongside it. Something fragile, dangerous, and impossible to deny. Hope. War did not pause for love or doubt. Outside the frozen palace, fleets clashed among the stars, and human resistance grew stronger each day. John could feel the weight of it pressing against him. He was caught in the middle. To the humans, he was already lost. News had spread of the Queen's strange decision, a human mechanic chosen as her consort. They called him traitor, weakling, or worse. John had even seen intercepted broadcasts where human leaders spat his name with anger. To them, he had become a symbol of surrender, of shame. But here, among the Queen's people, he was no better. Soldiers mocked him with their silence. Generals glared when his shadow fell beside hers. To them, he was an outsider who had tricked their ruler, an embarrassment staining their honor. John felt the loneliness sink deeper each day. When he walked, through the halls, whispers followed him like ghosts. When he sat at the Queen's side, he felt daggers in every gaze. He belonged nowhere, not to his own people, not to hers. Then came the day when fire reached even the throne ship. The Queen's fleet was moving through a sector thought safe, but the alarms shrieked in the middle of the night. John was thrown from his bed as explosions rattled the walls. The great ship groaned, ice shields cracking as missiles tore through. He stumbled into the command chamber, heart racing. The sight before him was chaos, officers shouting, soldiers running, and in the center of it all stood Frigid, calm and terrible, frost forming around her as she prepared for battle. "It is a trap," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. Humans and traitors together. On the view screens, John saw it. Human warships swarming alongside rebel vessels from her own empire. Together, they had struck at her throne. Frigid summoned her frost blade, the icy weapon glowing in her hand. Her armor shimmered, and her generals bowed low, awaiting her command. She was ready to fight to the death if needed, but John stepped forward, his hands shaking. "Wait," he said. "Let me try something." All eyes turned on him. The generals sneered. Some even reached for their weapons. "He dares," one spat, but the Queen raised her hand, silencing them. Her pale gaze locked on John. "You wish to face this battle with words?" He nodded, though his knees trembled. If they hear from you, they'll fight harder. If they hear from me, maybe, just maybe, they'll listen. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, slowly, she lowered her blade. Speak then, human. If you fail, we die. The words chilled him, but he turned to the broadcast channels. His voice, small and trembling at first, spread across the fleets, both hers and the humans. He told them who he was. Not a soldier, not a ruler, just a mechanic who had been caught in the storm of war. He spoke of what he had seen behind the Queen's armor. Not only power and ice, but a woman who had carried the weight of endless battles. He spoke of her loneliness, of the way she longed for things as simple as an ocean's waves or laughter around a table. Listen to me, John pleaded. I know you hate her, I know you hate me, but we've all lost too much. We've all been frozen by this war. Don't you want it to end? Some voices mocked him. Some laughed. The generals sneered. But John pressed on, his voice stronger. Now. She could have killed me 100 times. Instead, she listened. And if the dread Queen of Frost can listen, then maybe the rest of us can too. The chamber was silent except for the hum of engines and the distant thunder of battle. Even the Queen stood still, her icy eyes fixed on him, unreadable. For one heartbeat, John thought he had failed. But then across the channels, silence spread. Weapons that had been ready to fire suddenly paused. Ships held back, waiting. Soldiers hesitated. Not all, not many, but enough to break the rhythm of bloodshed. The battle did not end that night, but something far greater had begun, a crack in the wall between enemies. And as John stood there shaking and exhausted, he felt the Queen's cold hand on his shoulder. Her voice was quiet, only for him. You risked everything, for me. And though her hand was freezing, he did not pull away. The battle did not end that night, but something inside the galaxy shifted. For the first time, soldiers who had sworn to kill one another hesitated. For the first time, the Dread Queen had not answered an attack with frost and fire, but with silence. And for the first time, John's trembling voice had reached across the cold void and touched hearts that war had turned to stone. When the fleets pulled back, the throne ship floated scarred but alive. Fires burned in the lower decks and repairs began at once. John sat in the chamber, his body shaking from the weight of what he had done. He was not a leader, not a warrior. Yet somehow, he had spoken in a way that had made even enemies pause. He felt a shadow fall over him and looked up. Frigid stood there, her armor cracked, her blade sheathed. Her pale hair glimmered like falling snow, but her eyes, those eyes of endless winter, were different tonight. No one, she said slowly, has ever stood for me. Not like you did. John swallowed hard. He wanted to say it was nothing, that he had only spoken because he was desperate. But he saw the truth in her face. To her, it had meant everything. You don't have to carry it all alone, he said quietly. Even winter ends. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she reached out her hand. Cold as death, sharp as frost. But for the first time, she did not wear gloves and her skin touched his. John flinched at the icy bite, but he did not pull away. He closed his hand around hers, holding on. It was a simple gesture, yet it was more powerful than 1,000 battles. From that night onward, something in her changed. She still ruled with strength. She still punished betrayal with ice. She was still the queen feared across the stars. But in private, when the great halls were empty and only the two of them remained, she allowed pieces of herself to slip through the cracks. Once, John caught her standing in the garden, her hand resting on an ice flower. Her face was tilted toward the sky, her eyes closed. For a moment she looked peaceful, almost human. When she noticed him watching, she didn't scold him or turn away. She simply said, "If the sky here was warm, I think it would be beautiful." Another time, she sat across from him at the long table. Instead of silence, she asked him about his family, about the meals they had shared back on Earth. When he spoke of his mother's stew, her eyes softened as if she could almost taste it. And once, only once, When he told a silly joke, she laughed. Not loud, not cruel, but a quiet sound, soft and careful, as though laughter was something fragile she was afraid to break. Each moment was small, but together, they formed something greater. The frost was beginning to thaw. Of course, the court saw it too. The generals whispered more than ever. They warned her that he was changing her, weakening her. They begged her to cast him aside. But she silenced them with a single glance. The soldiers obeyed, but unease spread like cracks through the palace. John knew they hated him. He knew the humans still called him a traitor. But when she looked at him, really looked at him, he felt as though none of it mattered. One night, under the glow of frozen stars, she said softly, "You are the only one who does not see me as a weapon." John smiled faintly, his breath misting in the cold air. "That's because I see you, Frigid, not just the queen. You." Her eyes widened slightly at his words, and for once she had no answer. Instead, she stepped closer, so close that he felt her cold presence wrap around him like snow. Her hand brushed against his again, hesitant but real, and John realized the truth that terrified him most of all. He had not only cracked her ice, he had begun to melt his own fear, his own doubt. Somewhere between the loneliness of her halls and the frost of her gaze, he had fallen into something he could not deny. He cared for her, and maybe, just maybe, she cared too. Peace did not come in a single day. Wars never ended so quickly. The fleet still patrolled, soldiers still sharpened their weapons, and both humans and aliens whispered of betrayal. But something had changed, something too powerful to ignore. The Dread Queen was no longer untouchable, Frost. She had walked beside a human. She had listened. She had allowed herself to hold his hand where all could see, and though many called it weakness, others, quietly, secretly called it hope. John felt the weight of it every time he left his chamber. He could feel the stares of soldiers who hated him, but also the cautious eyes of those who now looked at him differently. Some with confusion, some with curiosity, and a few, just a few, with respect. He did not know how he had become a symbol. He did not want to be one. Yet each time he thought of turning back, he remembered the Queen's lonely eyes, the trembling in her fingers when she healed his wound, the sound of her rare, soft laughter. He could not walk away from that. Not anymore. The days stretched into weeks. He and Frigid sat together during council meetings. At first, she did all the speaking, her voice cold and commanding, while he sat silent. But sometimes, she would glance at him, waiting, and the generals would grind their teeth as he spoke. Slowly, his voice began to carry weight. Not because he had power, but because she had chosen to listen. At night, they still walked through the frozen gardens. Sometimes they spoke of Earth, sometimes of her battles, and sometimes of nothing at all. Silence between them was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, like the hush of snow falling. One evening, when the stars were bright and the ice flowers glowed faintly blue, John finally found the courage to say what had been sitting in his heart. "You know," he said with a nervous smile, "when I first said those words in your throne room, I didn't mean them. I was terrified, and it was just a stupid joke." Her pale eyes fixed on him, unreadable. "And now?" He swallowed, his breath turning white in the air. "Now, I think it's the only thing I've ever truly meant." The Queen of Frost stood silent, her silver hair stirring in the cold wind. For a long time she said nothing, and John feared his words had been foolish again. But then, slowly, she stepped closer. Her cold hand found his, and she held it tightly, as if afraid he might vanish. "For all my reign," she whispered, "I have been alone. But you see me." Her voice trembled, just enough for him to hear it. And in that moment, John understood what no army, no weapon, no throne could ever teach. Beneath the armor, beneath the frost, She was simply a woman who had longed for someone to stand beside her. He smiled, his chest heavy with emotion. Then let me ask properly this time. She tilted her head. Ask what? John dropped to one knee, the cold biting through his legs. But he did not care. He took her icy hand in both of his and looked up at her glowing eyes. Will you marry me, Frigid? Not because of a joke, not because of war, but because I want to. Because I choose you. The silence of the garden deepened. The stars above seemed to wait. Her generals would call it madness, his people would call it betrayal, but in this moment none of it mattered. The queen's lips curved into something rare, softer than a smile, warmer than any expression he had ever seen on her face. Yes, she said. The word was quiet, but it carried more weight than any command she had ever spoken. It was not the voice of the Dread Queen. It was the voice of Frigid, the woman who had allowed herself to feel. John rose, his heart thundering, and for the first time, she leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently against his. Her skin was freezing, but his warmth did not retreat. Together they stood in the middle of the frozen garden, the frost and the fire of their hearts bound as one. The galaxy would not understand. Many would still hate. Battles might still come. But this moment was theirs, unshakable. The human mechanic and the Queen of Ice. A joke had brought them together. Love would keep them there. And somewhere, far beyond the palace walls, the endless winter of war began to thaw.